So this is the third of a series we've done. The first one was just an introduction to coral. And then we talked a little bit about the ecosystems, biodiversity last week. And now we're going to really talk about what's been going on and what's been observed the past 20, 30 plus years, but really only gotten attention in the past couple, past decade. And it's really just the state and the decline of the reefs. But we'd like to get everybody sort of on the same page, not knowing everybody's background on coral. And they're colonial, they're single polyps that are connected by a membrane, and that's why we refer to coral as coral colonies. The polyps have two layers of, I'll call it skin, with a jelly mass in it. That mass is sort of what you would see in a jellyfish. They're out of the same family. Surrounding that outer layer of skin is a layer of mucus. Depending on the type of coral, it can be 1 or 2 millimeters thick to maybe up to 6 or 7. That's sort of like what we would call as a human skin. It protects them from bacteria and other pathogens in the water, so that if that gets abraded by divers or scrapes up against it, that opens a wound and gives a path for pathogens to get in there. How they eat is by two methods. One is these tentacles you see on the polyps. They open up and bring in plankton. Most corals, they have that opening at night. So if you're diving in the daytime and you come across a colony or a coral head, you will not see those tentacles open. Like one of the things on night dives to look for, to see if you can see corals feeding. Most of their food comes through a relationship they have with an algae called zooxanthellae. About 90% of it. This algae resides inside the coral, and it produces carbohydrates that feeds gives the nutrients to the coral, and then they live off each other. The corals also produce a limestone skeleton, and that's what we see a lot of when we refer to hard corals. And when we see about bleaching, that's what we will see is the remnants of the skeleton from the corals leaving. Not going to talk a lot about this other than keep these factors in mind. The slides location, we talked more about that in the first webinar, but temperature range of the water is a big factor. 68 to 86 plus or minus a couple degrees. So there's a narrow band of water temperature, and that's why you'll see the corals that we talk about dive in and where we hear most of the attention at for the decline of the reefs are in the tropics, because that's where you get the water temperature. Zooxanthellae makes their carbohydrates by photosynthesis, so they need sunlight. So most corals you see are going to be less than 80 feet deep. And then there's purity of water, acid. If it gets too acidic, they can't form the skeletons and other factors in here. But those are some of the things that keep in mind as we go through and talk about some of the factors and impacts to the reefs. Not going to have to spend a lot of time, because I think all of us who are participating today know that for many years the reefs have been declining. Some of the folks who have been diving for decades, they talk about huge colonies of some of the branching coral like we see at the bottom picture, the elkhorn, the staghorn coral. And those are gone, at least in the Caribbean, where we that disease and bleaching have taken those out and almost eliminated those. And then most recently, we hear about the bleaching, especially out on the Great Barrier Reef, where some estimates it could be as high as 30% bleaching. And then as tourism builds up, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, reefs get damaged from that way. So just a lot of factors are going into impacting the status of the reefs. Lawrence, if you could pass, oh, sorry about all that. Put in chat the link to the infographics. I'm learning and I forgot how to do the Zoom, so bear with me. Sorry about that, everybody. All right. It's
infographics?
a little hard to see maybe, but in chat there's a link to Google Drive where some of these infographics from this week and next week will be posted. Some of the things that we as humans and mankind are doing to damage the corals are septic systems. The pathogens and bacteria that come out of bad septic systems infect the corals. There's a local professor here where I live in Aiken, South Carolina, and he's a mentor on coral diseases. He was on a project there in the Keys a few, 20 years ago, where they were having a lot of disease showing up, and he got down there and he was a microbiologist and traced that back to human bacteria coming out of the failed septic systems there at people's houses, and then that prompted the Keys and Monroe County to develop a central waste treatment system. And it also increases nutrient loading into the water. Especially over the past few years, you've seen about the big algae blooms, and those get caused by nutrients flooding the water, the algae growing, taking over, and then they'll impact the reefs because either the algae will, if they're an invasive kind, they'll grow on the, or they block out the sunlight. A lot of attention also on sunscreens and reef-friendly ones. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but they have certain chemicals that can affect the reproduction ability of corals. Coastal development, when construction happens, you start getting a lot of runoff. You have silt and sedimentation coming out, and that blocks the water clarity, and that messes one up, a little bit of the chemistry, but also decreases the amount of sunlight which they'll need to help make the carbohydrates that corals need. So the sedimentation wash from construction areas. Storm runoffs that could go from miles depending on how big your watershed. Again, just debris, their nutrients, all the stuff that we see that is out in the streets and gutters. Deforestation, we hear a lot about that as smaller countries are starting to try to develop products that will, for housing, or they need it for the wood or for living, that they will start cutting down the trees. That dirt, then runs down into the rivers, and that then eventually gets into the ocean as well. And then we've talked a little bit about other toxins and sediments from similar type of activities. What's going on in the ocean is overfishing, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. Destructive fishing practices, if you're into paying attention to what is going on with the fish, that there are indiscriminate fishing practices by some countries of using huge nets that they just catch everything, pick out what they were wanting, and the rest of it's been dead, or long lines that they drag behind them, hooking all kinds of fish. And then just shipping, as ships travel, world trade increases. Over in the Indian Basin, I don't remember the island name, Manchurian or something like that, a vessel ran aground and it's leaking oil. So it runs aground, breaks open, and you get the oil coming in, damaging the environment. We don't hear as much about this in the northern hemispheres as much, but coral mining, people would go collect and get that and use that because there are good properties, and we talked about the benefits of that earlier for using it for bone replacements and for research purposes for drugs. Then people just want souvenirs. Unfortunately, there are still a few places down in the Keys that have a huge amount of coral sitting outside of the stores that people can go buy a piece of coral. So the overfishing, here up in the top part where I'm at is just the large fishing trawlers. They collect fish, they track where the spawning activities are. That's the largest concentration. That makes it easy, and they will stay offshore from people's territorial waters and then fish to the heart's content. It's been in the news probably from 2 to 3 weeks ago that a large number, 200 plus Chinese fishing vessels were sighted off the Galapagos Islands off the coast of Ecuador, just outside their marine park area. And if you know anything about that area, it's the convergence of several of the big currents. So lots of fish congregation there, a lot of big fish. So it's a good place for commercial fishermen, but it also, their practices would just clean out things. Spear fishermen, what's easy for them is the big fish. And last week we talked a little bit about the really tight biodiversity and food chain or activities on the reefs, that if you take away too many species, they're interdependent and the life of the reef collapse. So as the big ocean fish disappear, then the larger fish on the reefs, it leaves local fishermen to start looking and catching the smaller fish. And then you're going down the food chain, and eventually your fish supply disappears and the reef goes away, because the fish all have a vital role with respect to each other and the health of a reef. What we hear a lot more now really is with climate change, the higher water temperatures for a variety of reasons. And I wanted to point out that slide at the beginning of the narrow band of temperature that the corals can survive in. I talked earlier about the lowering of the pH, acid rain, chemical runoff, how that could affect the ability of corals to make their skeletons. And then UV radiation can just damage corals on some of the tides, the shallower reefs. Once you get to that real narrow band, it's warmer, and if it's going to sit there and get a lot more sunlight radiation coming from the sun, that's going to heat up faster. And all this means is the coral gets stressed and makes it more susceptible to disease. I know from my body, I realize that I don't get enough sleep, something happens to my body and I get more susceptible to just a simple cold. And that's the same thing with coral. If they're stressed for too many people around, and remember, these are living organisms, they're not just the rest we think they might be, or the water temperatures, or any of the factors that affect them that I had on that second slide, it just makes them more open to disease. And the pathogens are in the water. They've been in the water, will be in the water, get stress that makes them more susceptible to the pathogens invading the corals and causing the disease in that colony. Bleaching, it's not a fatal act like we often see. If it goes on for a long time and cyclic, comes back, it could be. But a single bleaching event, and then the water, and most of these are attributed to water temperature. Water temperature comes back to a more normal range. The zooxanthellae return, the tissues, the coral tissues start reproducing, and life goes on. But if you have a prolonged high temperatures, or if you have a lot of them back to back to back, like we're seeing sometimes out in the Pacific, then the corals are less likely to be able to recover. And that's why the concern about a single summer or something like that of higher temperatures, but the weather folks and those that are paying attention to the long-term trends, the slowly and continually heating up of the water is really of a concern to the corals. Now, they call it bleaching because the zooxanthellae also provide the color to the coral colonies, but sometimes for unknown reasons, the corals either just kick out the zooxanthellae or they leave on their own. Those happen rarely, but it does happen. But most of the time when you see whitish bleached out coral, it's because of water temperatures that have caused that stress, and the zooxanthellae has left. There's more things into what's going on than that, but that's a simple explanation for that. one of the things that I've opted to include here, because it's just trying to spread out the time versus next week, and I talked about tourism, that it's becoming more apparent as some of these smaller countries in the Caribbean, Southeast Asia that had great coral reefs, that they weren't taking care of them, and soon that tourism dollars was going to be impacted because the tourists come for the reefs and the clean water and things of that nature. And it's a complicated thing. If you have tourists, you need to have housing. You've got hotels, small islands. You have the potential for runoffs if you don't control it. You have more people. You can tax the waste treatment systems either solid, which means you might just have more debris laying around, and in a monsoon or a typhoon or a hurricane, all that gets washed out to the ocean. Or there are instances in the Philippines and other places that the waste systems are so old, they just dump raw sewage out into the ocean where their reefs are. So they've got to do a lining to help ensure their coastal areas are developed to support tourism, and it takes a concerted effort. Mainly, and a good example is involving the local people. One of the favorite dive destinations for this part of the world is using Bonaire down off the coast of South America. One of the things they have done back in like 2010 really started involving the local people and looking at how to designate their reef areas, to restrict fishing from the herbivores, the fish that eat the algae. And it became very successful, and that's why people enjoy going to Bonaire, because the health of their reefs are very good, and it looks like they're going to be able to be sustained that way, where many of the other nations, island nations in the Caribbean, had coral damage over the past decade. Bonaire's come out, good compared to everybody else. They had damages, but compared to many of their others, they did fairly well. And one of the things that we don't want to see is when they have to shut down diving areas. This is a picture of Cozumel, but they've realized that they had to do something. The tourism was destroyed. As I mentioned, that even though you're a snorkeler, or you might not think you kick a fin into a coral head, you don't feel it. If you just brush up against it, it removes that mucus from it, exposes that coral, and makes it more susceptible to diseases. And that's what they were beginning to see down in Cozumel. So last year, they shut down the southern end, very popular dive areas, for almost 6 months. They've opened them back up now, but sort of on a rolling basis. That some are open this month or this quarter, then they're closed, and sort of doing a rotation so they don't overtax some of their reefs, because they understand the importance of having that. And in Florida, they're looking at how they can expand the reef area, marine park around the Keys. A big effort's going on by NOAA and the Florida Wildlife Commission and others down there in the state, getting public input to see how they can expand it. What are some limits that they realize the importance of having that area protected for the fish, for the corals, because they both depend on each other. And that's it. Trying to keep this around 20 minutes. And I think I did that or came close. And want to see if folks learned something. Like to get some feedback on if we're hitting spots for something. So if somebody's learned something new for the first time, if you want to put it in chat or cue your mic and say, hey, this was something I learned new. And then, as Lawrence has been asking, if you have questions, any questions for what you heard today.
Hey, Tim.
Hey, Jason.
Hey, I guess the one thing that I learned, and make sure I got this right, is the algae kind of is a protection for the coral reefs.
It's I'm gonna say it's part of its lifeblood. It lives inside it, and it produces the food, 90% of the food that the coral needs. So the algae, meaning zooxanthellae, that one kind. Most of the algae that you hear about will grow on the coral and will smother them.
The
block out the
zooxanthellae, Tim,
sunlight, and that's why there are some fish that are good because they will eat the algae that is on coral. But the algae that I was talking about here, that zooxanthellae, is actually inside the coral polyp and provides the nutrients.
so there's a symbiotic relationship between the zooxanthellae and the coral.
Right.
Okay.
They help each other out. Yeah, Sean, I hadn't talked to, Sean made a comment in here about Cozumel diving. I had talked to Michelle about what they were able to do and not do, because she and I think Cam were down there a month or so ago. But I paid attention because that was relatively new, of just for something like Cozumel shutting it down. It wasn't all their areas; it was just the southern end that was highlighted. But you know, they realized they had to take drastic measures. The island in the Philippines I was talking about, where they had the waste, and I can't remember the island's name. It starts with an A, I think. They shut down completely for 6 months as well, just the whole everything, not just part of it, because the waste coming into the ocean and on land had gotten so bad. So extreme measures, but when things get bad, people realize they need to take something to turn it around quickly.
I'm just glad that some of these island nations and other areas are learning from all of this and trying to take proactive or at least reactive measures to try and protect the coral.
And I know that's, you know, Bonaire had learned lessons, and most of the countries are figuring that out now. But there's still the fishing on a lot of, especially in Southeast Asia. A lot of the people rely on reef fish to survive. You know, their income level, that's their livelihood. That's where they get their protein, is taking their little boats out there and trying to catch a few fish for the day, try to sell them or eat them themselves, and trying to balance that livelihood against the health of the reef. But you know, Bonaire made that decision. They just outlawed completely parrotfish initially, and then it went to herbivores, and then a large part of the carnivores. So at least in that marine park area around there. So folks are starting to do that. So it could be turning around. So it's not all lost. Oh, so Felicia did a coral restoration in Bonaire. So I was hoping to do a coral dive down there with one of the things. The shop had a trip planned. No, I was thinking the group, that it was either with Buddy Dive or Divvy Dive. So the thing that on Cozumel was they really attributed to tourism that was helping spread the disease. They were concerned disease showing up, especially white plague, and there was no evidence that was showing what was making it more susceptible to them at that point in time. So that whether or not it was data or just they were comparing sheer numbers of people, but they were suspecting just the increase in tourism and people diving down there was correlated to their increase in diseases. And that's, at least that's what I'd seen from the official publications out of the government.
Tim, do you think that it's possible for us to put together some type of coral project when we go to Grand Cayman in February?
I know there is a group, a couple that created an organization that does coral planning and things of that nature. So yes, Sunset House has their own little nursery. They got approval. It's small, but there is I'd have to go look up my email string, but somebody told me. So yes, there is something you could do. And I think, as Chris was saying, most of the countries, or at least the smaller island countries, are doing something like that. so we can find things, and many of them are recognizing that that helps them with awareness, and especially if they're going to want you to go do coral maintenance. You know, what Sarah and I did in Roatan, Sarah's my daughter, we clean trees for an hour, you know, and that takes a long time. And if you've got 100 trees out there growing corals, they have to be cleaned in the summertime every 2 to 4 weeks. So having volunteers that pay money to go clean a tree is even better. One of the things, Felicia, I'd need to send you something in preparation for this Bonaire trip that did not happen. I did a little bit of research and came up with a presentation on corals in Bonaire. So when did coral dives in your coral restoration class down there? What year? Because I'm curious if it was fairly recent or like 2015.
So Tim, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I was there 2 years ago and did the coral class.
Okay.
Actually, my family was there for a month, and so I did the class the first week, and then I was able to do 2 dives a week for the rest of the time that we were there.
Wow.
Okay.
Well, 2 dives.
We
go out and do 2 dives 2 different days, because normally Buddy does the dives on Tuesday, Thursday.
Okay. Okay. Because I know that's usually why Lawrence was asking me, he's talking about a shop trip. I usually get asking, all right, can we do something with coral about that? And one of the things that might have to wait until warmer weather, and we know it's going to be good conditions down in Florida, is I've made some contacts with some of the research institutes down in the Keys, and to go down there and just do some coral education, go into a Key Marine lab that is doing a lot of the disease research, or if somebody is interested in a drive down there, we can stop through Sarasota or south of Tampa, where Florida Aquarium's doing their research as well. So.
Thank you.
Anything else? Well, thank y'all. Thank you for the questions, comments. Felicia, thank you for your input, and